August 15, 1945. A terrible new weapon had ended the war. The cheering crowds had known about it for just 9 days, but a small group of brilliant scientific minds had been working towards it since the early 30s, while the politicians were all talking about peace and disarmament.
And we are going to go to Geneva determined by persuasion, by argument, by appeals to what has been written, appeals to pledges already taken, appeals to history, appeals to common sense, to get the nations of the world to join in and reduce this enormous, disgraceful burden of armaments which we are now bearing from one end of the world to the other. You will never disarm, you will never effect real disarmament until you renounce war not merely on a scroll of paper, but in the hearts of men.
The story begins here, the ancient, quiet university town of Göttingen in Germany. Professor Niels Bohr, the great man of physics, lectured here, and the work and discussions and the seminars here between the wars made it the mecca for physicists from all over the world. Most of the leading ones visited Göttingen, many stayed to work. In the 20s and 30s, you could hardly turn a corner without bumping into one of the world's leading scientists. In retrospect, those years in Göttingen have been called the beautiful years, the innocent years. Physics was a ferment of new discoveries and new theories, and the physicists from all countries worked together, absorbed, fascinated, and blind to the world outside. If you look at a group photo taken around 1930, you see a band of idealistic seekers after abstract knowledge sitting at the feet of their master, Niels Bohr. You could never have convinced him that the friends he had gathered around him would, between them, produce the most deadly weapon ever known. Paul Dirac, the British theoretical physicist, Werner von Heisenberg, a German, and like Bohr, one of the great physicists of this century. Next to him, the Austrian Jewess Lise Meitner, who came to physics by way of radiochemistry. Her nephew, Otto Frisch, also an Austrian Jew, and another Jew, Rudolf Peierls, with whom he was later to make a crucial discovery. Robert Oppenheimer, one of the most brilliant young American physicists and the son of a Jewish emigre. Edward Teller, a Hungarian Jew, and a close friend of the German physicist Carl von Weizsacker, son of Germany's Secretary of State. Here at Göttingen, distinctions between Jew and Gentile, French and German, were irrelevant. The only problem was the nature of the atom. It was a comfortable world, but it was a dream world, and it couldn't last. For a time, the physicists at Göttingen managed to ignore the turmoil outside the university walls. They could still work at physics under a military dictatorship, but too many of the great physicists were Jews for Göttingen to survive Hitler's racial persecutions. When Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, it wasn't only the old order in Germany which moved out. After the fall of Hindenburg, more and more Jews began to leave Germany. It was the eminent who were most vulnerable, and the eminent included the best physicists. On board the refugee ships went Albert Einstein, Otto Frisch and Lise Meitner, Rudolf Peierls, Edward Teller, the Italian Enrico Fermi, Max Born, and many more. The Göttingen party was over. Now the work went on outside Germany, in Britain and America. And amongst all physicists, the conviction was growing that there was one atom whose tremendous power could be released and harnessed, the uranium atom. In February 1939, a new concept had been born, atomic fission. To all physicists, it was a momentous idea. One of them, a young Jew called Fritz Houtermans, had been out of touch with scientific developments. He had been imprisoned by the Gestapo. Now they realized his knowledge might be useful and prepared to release him. He started trying to catch up on the news.
I was still not set free by the Gestapo, but I had within my reach a telephone. So I telephoned a friend of mine named Robert Rompe, who is now a professor in Berlin, and told him, look, here nearly 3 years I didn't hear what's news in physics, and he told me the news is uranium fission discovered by Hahn. And then I said on the telephone, but if this is so, then there should come out neutrons, superfluous neutrons, made by neutrons. And he said, yes, they do. And I said, but then it would be possible to make a chain reaction. And he said, yes, but we can't talk over that on the telephone.
Now Hitler was advancing through Austria and through Poland, and Europe was at war. At the same time, the scientists were getting closer to the secret. In Paris, Madame Curie's daughter and her husband, Frédéric Joliot, had found out more about the disintegration of the uranium atom. In Copenhagen, Lise Meitner had discovered what actually happened to the nucleus when fission occurred, working with her nephew, Otto Frisch. But now the terrible military implications were becoming clear, and the scientists' work was secret. In Britain, many of them had gone to work under the guidance of Rutherford at Cambridge. Others had gone to America. One of them, Leo Szilard, urgently visited Einstein. He was obsessed with the fear that Hitler's physicists were already working on a bomb, and persuaded Einstein to write to Roosevelt, advising America to do the same. Einstein shared Szillard's fears and wrote the letter. To F.D. Roosevelt, President of the United States. Some recent work by E. Fermi and L. Szilard leads me to expect that the element uranium may be turned into a new source of energy. This new phenomenon would lead to the construction of bombs. A single bomb of this type might well destroy a whole port with the surrounding territory. I understand that Germany has actually stopped the sale of uranium from the Czechoslovakian mines. That she should have taken such early action might perhaps be understood on the ground that the son of the German Under-Secretary of State, von Weizsacker, is attached to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. Yours very truly, A. Einstein. So already suspicion was splitting up the International Brotherhood of Physicists. The question was, could a pupil of Niels Bohr's like von Weizsäcker already be working on a terrible bomb for Hitler?
I think it was a plausible guess from the side of Szilard or Einstein that my father might have been connected with it, but it was wrong. They couldn't know, and of course they shouldn't know then, that my father was secretly connected with the people who were in opposition to Hitler and who in 1944 finally made the attempt on his life. I may perhaps say that early in Hitler's regime I was tempted to be connected with it, perhaps to join the party, because I felt this was a very powerful affair and it might be the future of my country. But then I was kept from doing so by two facts. One was the way the Nazis behaved towards the Jews, which I couldn't swallow. And the other thing was that my father constantly, from 1933 on, told me that he knew Hitler sufficiently well to say that he was a criminal and a madman. And so he succeeded in keeping me from joining these things.
When Roosevelt received Einstein's letter in October 1939, he set up an advisory committee on uranium, but at that stage did not finance research. All the same, research went on. Enrico Fermi, the Italian physicist working in New York, already saw very clearly the damage an atom bomb could do. He talked about it to a fellow refugee, some Goudsmit, at about that time. It was the scientists from Europe who were the most passionate advocates of beating Hitler to the bomb.
In January 1940, Enrico Fermi at Columbia University took me to the window, one of the top floors, and said, if this bomb really succeeds, it will destroy such and such a section of New York City, at least. He pointed out with his fingers the outline. and I was greatly impressed and scared at the same time.
Otto Frisch, the refugee, was now in England, and while Fermi saw what the bomb might do, Frisch was beginning to see how it might be made to do it.
Well, the possibility of a chain reaction came to me rather later, and at first I discarded it for rather poor reasons. But later I realized it was probably possible. But Bohr then gave some arguments that it would not be practicable, that at any rate ordinary uranium would either not support a chain reaction at all, or only a slowish one, which would not cause a devastating explosion. And I said as much in a report on nuclear physics, which I wrote for the Chemical Society sometime in the winter 39-40, when I was in Birmingham in England. But having written that article where I said that an explosion was probably impossible, I got to think about it more carefully, and just tentatively I tried to work out what would a spherical mass of pure uranium-235 do if anybody could make it. And there, to my great surprise, I found that quite a small mass might cause an explosion, and a very big one, and moreover that it might not be all that difficult to make such an object.
Now France fell, and the Germans swept on to the Channel. As Europe succumbed to Hitler, the scientists in Britain and America worked on with increasing urgency. Always they were obsessed by the fear of what would happen if an atom bomb became available to a nation consumed by such ruthless militarism. They knew the devastation in Europe was tiny by comparison with atomic devastation. They had lived under Hitler, and they dreaded the thought of such a weapon in the hands of that temperament and mentality.
2 oder 3 Monate vergangen sind, wird euer Terror voraus im Norden und im Westen. Überall, wo Deutsche leben, so ein heiliges deutsches Jahrhunderte währender Garant. Fabriken werden gegründet für ein herrliches deutsches Volk und unser liebes deutsches Reich. Mit dem Tag hat sich an Woche um Woche...
Already, Heisenberg and von Weizsacker might be developing an atom bomb for Hitler. To many of the refugee scientists, like Joseph Rotblat, there was only one answer.
Well, I was terribly worried at the time about the possibility of Germany producing the atom bomb, because the possibility of such a bomb was known already, even in the, not only in the scientific, but also in the daily press. And so it was quite possible that despite the loss of many refugees from Germany, enough German scientists who were left there for Hitler to be able to carry out this project if he wanted to. And I was quite convinced that if he could make the bomb, he would use it. And the only reason why he wouldn't use it would be the fear of retaliation. And for this reason, I felt it's quite important, essential, that we should, first of all, know whether a bomb is possible, and if so, we should have it, just in case.
Did the refugees like Rotblat and Frisch see the making of an atom bomb as a moral question?
Well, not really, I would say, because we were at war with Hitler, and it seemed so a weapon, such a decisive weapon existed, that we must look into it and, if possible, make that weapon. We couldn't leave it to the chance, we couldn't risk that Hitler might get hold of it, and after all, he had some good scientists.
What were the Germans doing? They had excellent laboratories and a brilliant nuclear physicist in Heisenberg, and the crucial discovery, the principle of uranium fission, was well known to them. It's still not quite clear whether they headed Hitler off the bomb or tried to develop it and failed. Certainly they started a uranium club to investigate atomic energy generally. Equally, though they were loyal Germans, they were not Hitler supporters, and subsequent events may have blurred their recollections. What is known is that Heisenberg went to see Niels Bohr in occupied Denmark in 1941. He took von Weizsacker with him. The meeting is also remembered by a physicist with no reason to love or defend the regime, the ex-Gestapo prisoner Fritz Houtermans.
In fact, it must have been in September 1941 and I had to go away from Berlin. At that time, and next day, I knew that next day Heisenberg and Weizsacker were going to leave Germany for Copenhagen to visit Bohr and to visit Bohr. And so I talked to von Weizsacker and tried to persuade him not only in my name, but also in the name of one of last year's Nobel Prize winners, Hans Jensen, to talk to Niels Bohr, tell him frankly that there is such thing as that uranium club, and tell him that you want to get what I call general absolution for doing so, guaranteeing that no bomb would come out of this effort.
Niels Bohr was half Jewish, but still allowed to work in Copenhagen. Heisenberg had been perhaps the favorite of all his pupils, and Heisenberg's deep affection and admiration for Bohr were well known. So, in a sense, the visit doesn't need an explanation. But the fact remains that Germany's greatest physicist went to see the great Niels Bohr at a time when the possibility of developing an atom bomb was a burning question in physics. Why?
We knew sufficiently well at that time that most probably this would not happen during the war in Germany, and we didn't expect it to happen in any other country during the war, but finally it might happen. And we were not certain about the possibilities. And then the question was what physicists should do in a situation in which their own work might finally be the one on which the responsibility would be put, and rightly be put, for having made such a thing as an atomic bomb. So I think this was a question which one could very well ask a revered person as Niels Bohr was.
Was it Niels Bohr, the father confessor, whom Heisenberg visited, or Niels Bohr, the man in closest touch with developments in nuclear physics outside Germany? Heisenberg today has his own account of why the meeting took place.
At that time, the scientific work on the uranium project in Germany had reached a stage in which we knew that, in principle, atomic explosions and atomic bombs were possible. But at the same time, we knew that producing atomic bombs would mean an enormous industrial effort. Actually, our estimate of the effort was probably still larger than it actually was at the end. But we felt that in this situation, the physicists really had some influence on the further development of the projects, because the physicists could argue in two ways. They could say, one can make atomic bombs, therefore one should try to make atomic bombs. They could also argue by saying, well, it requires such an enormous industrial effort that it will actually weaken our war effort during the next years, and probably the bombs won't be ready before the end of the war, therefore it's no use to make atomic bombs. Now, since in this way the physicists seem to have a strong influence on the further developments, I felt that it was good to ask Bohr's advice. Now, of course, I knew that Bohr was a Dane and Denmark was occupied by German troops, so it was obvious that Bohr would have very strong feelings in this matter. At the same time, I felt that Bohr and I were good friends, and he knew my attitude to problems of this kind from earlier years, so I felt that still this would be a good basis for confidence and for conversation on this problem.
Well, unfortunately, I think Bohr didn't understand really what Heisenberg was out after. I wasn't present, but Heisenberg told me afterwards, and he was disappointed. He said that in the moment when Bohr had realized that Heisenberg was speaking about this possibility, he somehow became so excited that he couldn't any further listen to what Heisenberg wished to ask him.
But was it really the moral duty of a physicist working for Hitler that Heisenberg went to discuss? Or could it have been to check with Bohr if his belief that an atomic bomb could be made was correct?
No, that is absolutely impossible. I never asked him any questions about physics in that connection. I just wanted to have his human advice.
And yet the debate goes on. Sam Goudsmit, a refugee physicist, believes Germany had no atom bomb only because they never hit on the idea of fast neutron bombardment devised by Otto Frisch and Rudolf Peierls, two exiled Jews in England in 1940.
I still strongly believe that the aim was eventually to get atomic bombs. If the war had lasted long enough, that was what they intended to do. What they talk about now, and what some people claim is the truth, namely that they did not want to make a bomb, is probably a rationalization after the fact. All documents and later published papers indicate that in the back of their mind they hope to produce that weapon. Physicists always do things like that because to them, at the roots of it was that it was a grandiose physics problem. They wanted to be sure that they could do it.
Britain now more than anyone possessed the knowledge, the scientists and the motive to produce a bomb. But to start with, she lacked the determination. The Admiralty in 1939 took comfort in the fact that other nations were not stockpiling uranium and used it to argue that they must therefore have decided that chances of success were too remote, that they didn't justify diverting brains and money from more immediate problems. But Frisch and Peierls' idea of fast neutron bombardment changed everything. Now, for the first time, service chiefs and government ministers were interested, very interested. In the summer of 1940, during the Battle of Britain, a new committee, the Maud Committee, sponsored urgent research on it in Oxford, Cambridge, Birmingham and Liverpool. By the spring of 1941, it was clear that this way, a bomb was a practical possibility. The Americans had been even slower. They didn't know about Frisch and Peierls' discovery, but late in 1941, they saw the Maud Committee's report. The effect was galvanic. If Britain had gone so far, perhaps Germany had too. On December the 6th, Roosevelt authorized substantial funds for the construction of an atom bomb. The next day, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Now America was in the war. It would be hard to imagine a more dramatic launching for her atom bomb research program. At their first meeting after they became allies, Churchill and Roosevelt decided to concentrate the work of their two teams in North America, and they allocated it a sum of money undreamt of in the whole history of scientific research, $2,000 million. Colonel Leslie Groves was put in charge of the operation, directly responsible to the War Department. It was codenamed the Manhattan Project. Groves told his staff, "At great expense, we have gathered here the largest collection of crackpots ever seen." His chief military distinction so far had been supervising the building of the Pentagon. He was in sharp contrast with the scientific leader, the brilliant young American with former communist connections, Robert Oppenheimer. Despite his high Göttingen reputation, Oppenheimer still lacked a real achievement in physics. Now he had a unique chance of fame.
This was before the turn of the war. This before Alamein and Stalingrad. And the nature of the job was only in part known, the nature of the technical job, the rather odd conditions under which we were to live and work in the hope of keeping things secret, the reluctance of a good many of my colleagues to take off for what they feared would be some sort of prison camp, some doubts as to my fitness for getting it done made me worried. Also, I had then, as I've had throughout this whole thing, I'm not completely free of a sense of guilt.
General Groves' approach to the enterprise was less hesitant.
I know what I thought at that time, which was that they were about maybe 60% at the most chance of success. That is what I reported to General Marshall a few months after I took over. They may well, I didn't feel they were any better than that. But as far as I was concerned, it was important for me to always display to everyone in the organization the utmost confidence in our success. And that was done throughout. From the day that I took over, never once did I utter any doubt as to our success to anyone in the organization.
2 months after Groves and Oppenheimer were appointed, a vital experiment took place in Chicago. On December the 2nd, 1942, Enrico Fermi was ready to attempt the world's first chain reaction. To the horror of his superiors, he chose the football stadium of Chicago University. He had no time to build his pile in a safer and more remote location. Under the pseudo-Gothic football stand, there was a disused rackets court. It was there that Fermi prepared to put 4 years of research to the test. If his calculations were wrong, Chicago could be blown flat. Fermi's urgency sprang chiefly from his knowledge that the authorities were considering stopping his work as unprofitable. He and his team worked furiously to give a demonstration of the chain reaction they knew they could trigger off. They started at 9:45 a.m. on the demonstration day. The pile contained 500 tons of graphite, 6 tons of uranium metal, 50 tons of uranium oxide. It was fitted with cadmium rods which stopped the reaction. One by one, they had to be removed till the pile went critical. Fermi checked his instruments each time. For 5.5 hours, the experiment continued. Then the chain reaction began. But the authorities watching in the gallery of the rackets court had seen what they came for. It was already clear that the work on the Manhattan Project had to find a home, somewhere more remote and spacious than the rackets court of Chicago University. After 1 or 2 false trails, Oppenheimer remembered a remote part of New Mexico where he had spent part of his school days. He and General Groves drove out to survey it. The place was on a beautiful but desolate plateau of pine woods and rocky canyons 7,000 feet above sea level. Santa Fe, the nearest town, was 20 miles away. On top of the plateau was a school, the Los Alamos Ranch School for Boys. To Groves, from now on, Los Alamos, the tiny homestead in the New Mexico hills, was to be the center of the most intensive research project since the world began. The decision was taken in the winter of 1942. Work began almost at once, and by early March, the first of the atomic scientists began to filter out to their new home. One of the early arrivals was an Englishman, Jim Tuck.
This was the place that was supposed to know what it was doing, what it was for, and was intended in the early days to be a very modest number of people, something like 40 scientists. Well, it didn't work out that way, and they soon ran into difficulties. So, the kind of knowledge or the kind of skill that I had developed over this explosive business turned out to be just what they wanted here. So the Americans asked Churchill or Charwell if I could go, and they were delighted to have one of their men, so to speak, here, so I was sent. There were 2 or 3 British mission people here when I arrived, and this number later increased to about 14.
I think it's perhaps hard to estimate what would have happened without the British contribution. It was very valuable, but if they hadn't been there, it's hard to know who would have taken their place and how it would have gone. I think that the fact that the British were convinced very early by Simon and Peierls that this had to be done probably was the greatest single factor in getting the job done when it was. I think that if the British government had not been committed, we might have been very much slower in this country to put the necessary resources into it.
Quickly, Los Alamos began to take shape and equipment arrived. A generator from Wisconsin University, an accelerator from Illinois, a cyclotron from Harvard. The buildings were temporary and the working conditions were rugged. Radioactive materials were handled in a thoroughly primitive way, but by June 1943, research was underway. The original estimate of numbers was wildly wrong. By the end of 1943, Los Alamos had a population of 3,500. A year later, it was a town of 6,000. And the other research establishments were spreading and spawning at the same time at places like Clinton and Oak Ridge and Hanford, researching, experimenting, and feeding Los Alamos with materials like plutonium and uranium-235. But Los Alamos needed more than materials, it needed brains. They couldn't indent for brains, they had to persuade them, and Oppenheimer proved a brilliant persuader. Some physicists he recruited with the prospect of fascinating new discoveries, some by playing on their fear of Hitler's possible atom bomb. Some came out of hero worship, like Harold Agnew.
It was just wonderful working under Oppie, at least for those young people such as ourselves. He was a model leader for the group. I remember one particular circumstance when some of us were rather upset at the wage scale which was being paid to some of the craftsmen, let's say plumbers, for example, versus the wage scale that was paid to us as junior scientists, if I can use that term. And one time we went in to see Oppie. Actually, Oppie would come around the laboratory and just stop in. He sort of made a weekly tour almost of stopping in all over the project to give you words of encouragement, find out what you were doing, and sort of spur you on. We brought this up about the disparity of salaries between those of us with technical education and background and so forth and so on, and what they were paying the craftspeople, plumbers and so on. It was maybe a factor of 2 or 3 in salary. And Oppie talked to us, and by the time we finished talking with him, we were happy that we weren't getting paid so much money, because he had instilled upon us the idea that we knew what we were doing and why we were doing it, and this alone should be sufficient. He had a terrific charm and a sense of urgency, and it was very wonderful to work with him and follow his leadership.
The work was hard and the conditions were primitive, but there were compensations, especially for the junior scientists like Tuck.
I'd never enjoyed science so much in my whole life. I've dubbed that period, Oppenheimer, to his retirement from here, the Athenian period of this place. It had all the greatest scientists of the Western world, and something I'd never known before. They didn't care who you were or what you were. All they cared about was what you could contribute, what you had in the way of ideas. This was new to me. I met scientists I would never have expected to have even seen in my whole life before. I did have some luck in contributions, and I had a simply marvelous time.
In their rock-bound isolation at Los Alamos, the scientists worked feverishly towards the bomb. In retrospect, it may seem a terrible travesty of the spirit of Göttingen, but many of them were European Jews, and all of them were afraid Hitler might build the bomb first. But one man was looking beyond the present. Niels Bohr had escaped from occupied Denmark and was now in America. He grew increasingly concerned about what would happen after the bomb was dropped. His great eminence gave him access to the Allied leaders. He tried to explain to Roosevelt his fears of an atomic arms race with Russia, even a terrible atomic war, and to suggest international control jointly with Russia. He also spoke to Churchill, but he always found great difficulty in communicating his ideas intelligibly, as Heisenberg had discovered at their famous meeting in Copenhagen. Churchill said they didn't speak the same language. Many others must have sympathized.
And the water. Oh, such some horror. Always to say the same kind. I was deeply interested in...
Even Bohr's own colleagues often found him hard to follow, like Emilio Segre.
I saw Bohr quite frequently at Los Alamos during the war, for periods almost daily. And we talked about physics, principally. It was not easy to communicate with Bohr, mainly because of the physical difficulty in understanding his speech, at least for me. And our conversation was mainly limited to physics. Now, after the war, I saw him several times at his home in Copenhagen and so on, and then he told me something about his efforts to speak with Churchill, but I didn't understand well what he said. I mean, it was very difficult to communicate with him.
The one great tragedy was that Bohr, who worked alone and who talked with Roosevelt and who talked with Churchill, was not clearly understood, and that his counsel was perverted. I do not think the fact that it was rejected is as important as that it was not understood. But Bohr is a very special case. There are plenty of physicists who don't understand what he is talking about when he talks. He's a very hard man to hear and not entirely easy to follow. I would not think that, I think if there was an error there, it was that he did not have the right intermediaries, above all in the United Kingdom, to introduce him and to help explain the drift of what he was saying.
The flying bomb, the V1. For those who knew, the V1 had a special menace. Of the V1s carried orthodox explosive like the V2s which followed them. But the early ones could be rangefinders, and no one could tell if just one carried a different explosive in its warhead. The interception and destruction of every possible flying bomb became a desperate occupation.
I was in London, in fact, during several air raids in 1943. I'd learned to ignore the shelters. But when the V1 started, in June 44, that was the first time that I became scared, because the little information I had made me believe that they might be loaded with atomic bombs. It was the first time that I thought might be a good idea to go to a shelter. I was told if I go to one of the big hotels, I might find pretty ladies in their negligees in the shelter. But I was disappointed. When I got down there was only one other person, a Chinese general.
June the 6th, 1944, D-Day. But for the scientists, the strategic aims of the invasion were secondary. At last they had a chance of finding what the German physicists had achieved. An Allied scientific mission went in close behind the armies, hunting for evidence of an atomic research program. Uranium supplies, reactors, calculations, anything. The scientific head of the mission was one of the Hitler refugees, Sam Goudsmit.
At the beginning, there were some difficulties and differences because of the different way of thinking and operating. For example, I received a very secret dispatch that I had to look for a physicist who had been in the United States. The information they gave me were his beer drinking habits, his opinion about American women, nothing about his physics, that he had had German measles in 1939, that he had been vaccinated against smallpox, a polyp in his right nostril, and only one testicle. With that information, I was supposed to find him. We ran across him later on in Berlin. I didn't check up on the details, however.
The Alsos mission, as it was called, followed the armies over the Rhine and into Germany. For 4 months after D-Day, they searched and inquired without success. The question whether the Germans had an atom bomb program stayed unanswered.
As I said before, I was scared that they had one. But when we came to Strasbourg, that was in November 1944, and found the files of Professor von Weizsacker, the situation changed completely. I was very relieved. His paper showed definitely that they were way behind in the project, that they had not yet succeeded at that time to make an atomic reactor work. And in fact, I said to one of our officers, you know, It's really marvelous that they do not have an atomic bomb. Now we don't need to use ours. But he answered, Sam, you understand, of course, if we have a bomb like that, we are going to use it.
If we have a bomb, we're going to use it. Once again, Leo Szilard was the first to see the danger and take action. The original letter he persuaded Einstein to sign was prompted by the fear of Hitler with an atom bomb. Like the other émigré scientists, he believed the justification of science was service to man. It was a denial of all their beliefs to make an atom bomb not as a countermeasure, but as an aggressive weapon. Again, Szilard went urgently to Einstein. They composed another letter to Roosevelt warning him of the dangers of using the bomb, in particular the danger of America's vulnerability to nuclear attack. But they were too late. As Roosevelt's coffin was drawn through the streets of Washington, Einstein's letter still lay untouched on his desk. It was April 1945. Germany was broken and in ruins. Any remaining fears of an atomic bombardment by Hitler were swept away. If the scientists could have been sure of this when war broke out, the bomb would probably never have been begun. But now, while Germany crumbled, the bomb was nearing completion, the culmination of 2.5 years' intensive work and millions upon millions of dollars. And there was still an enemy in the field. The destruction and humiliation of the chief enemy now presented the scientists and statesmen and military leaders with a new situation which prompted a new question. Should they still go on with the Manhattan Project?
The main purpose of making an atomic bomb was not there anymore. This was my general reaction, namely, the paramount purpose was to finish the war in Europe as fast as possible and to destroy Hitler. Once this had happened, everything was somewhat of an anticlimax. And I remember very well that this was said very explicitly because we received the news of the capitulation of Germany while we were in the desert in Alamogordo and saw a test explosion with ordinary explosives. And we had this explosion, and then shortly thereafter we heard about the capitulation of Germany. The general reaction was, well, we missed the boat.
In fact, I left Los Alamos in December 1944. I believe I was the first person to leave the project. Well, the reasons for this were quite simple. I mentioned before that the reason why I started to work on the atom bomb was because I was afraid that Hitler may have the bomb and use it against us. And for this reason, it was important that we should have it too. But by that time, I became convinced that Hitler is not going to have the bomb. We had various sorts of intelligence, various reports, which would indicate that this is unlikely, most unlikely to happen. The war with Germany was nearly to close. After D-Day, I think it became clear that the war will be finished. And therefore, the prime reason for my working on this project has ceased. Therefore, as soon as I became convinced about this, I've asked for permission to leave, and I went back to England.
When Truman succeeded Roosevelt at the White House, he didn't even know the Manhattan Project existed. He was hurriedly briefed by Henry Stimson, the Secretary for War. One of the first meetings arranged for the new President and Commander-in-Chief was a major discussion on the war with Japan. Everyone knew that in military and strategic terms, she was a beaten nation. On the other hand, her soldiers were still fighting fiercely. The question was, should the bomb be used? And if so, how? There were 4 courses open. Not to use it at all, to drop it on a nominated target in Japan after a warning, to invite Japanese observers to a demonstration in America, or just to drop it. Truman appointed an interim committee to advise him. It was chiefly a political and military group, but it appointed a scientific advisory panel. The Italian Nobel Prize winner Enrico Fermi, who started the first chain reaction, Ernest Lawrence, an American Nobel Prize winner, Arthur Compton, also an American Nobel Prize winner, the man who had appointed Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer himself. But did they pass on the feelings of their fellow scientists about the use of the atom bomb? Or were they just technical advisors? Is it true, as one of them, Arthur Compton, wrote after the war, that throughout the discussion it seemed to be a foregone conclusion that the bomb would be dropped?
I think it is hard for me to answer that question. The parts of the meeting that I remember, I believe that they were the most protracted, the deepest, the most intense, ones in which the Secretary of War, Colonel Stimson, and General Marshall participated, had to do with the post-war future, with the prospects, technical prospects, which we were not all knowing about, but of which we knew something, and the human prospects, the possibility of collaboration with other countries, the possibilities of control, the control of information, the hope of an open attitude, above all the relations with Russia, and what this would do to them, how it might injure or help them. I think that it probably was assumed, it certainly was always assumed at Los Alamos, that if the war were not over and not clearly to be brought to a conclusion by diplomatic means, this weapon would play a part. I'm not sure that the men who sat around that room all had the same idea of what would happen with the bomb, and I therefore can neither confirm nor refute what Compton wrote. I think there was some discussion in which I didn't participate about the use of the bomb, but there was none in which I did.
But some scientists, like James Frank, a former Göttingen professor, were becoming desperately concerned. He and a group of his Chicago colleagues were acutely aware that they alone among mankind knew the terrible act that their leaders were considering and its possible consequences for the world. Under Frank's chairmanship, they produced a report pleading for international control and urging that the first bomb should be dropped on an uninhabited island as a demonstration to the Japanese. But was the government's advisory panel of scientists as perturbed as their colleagues? Was the possibility of a demonstration test of the bomb ever discussed with the interim committee or at their own meetings?
In our presence, the panel's presence, it was not, I think, discussed with the interim committee, but I did have a request to gather the panel at Los Alamos and consider, among other things, this question. This was, I should say, before we had ever fired a bomb. We didn't know how big it would be. We didn't visualize exactly what it would do, but we did think about whether its destructiveness, its danger, could be vividly demonstrated over a barren and uninhabited target, and we were very doubtful of that. We probably did not do justice to its pyrotechnic qualities, which became apparent only later, which were known on paper but not realized. And the panel, as is well known, answered that it was doubtful that a demonstration over a desert area or the sea would be very effective.
But according to Groves, the interim committee was fully aware of the arguments in the Frank report.
We had handled that in two ways. First, I believe that I had informed the committee as to the contents of it, and then it was very carefully considered by a scientific panel to the interim committee, which was made up of 3 Nobel Prize winners and Dr. Oppenheimer, who was the head of the Los Alamos Laboratory. And we felt that these men represented the viewpoints of the scientists and could not necessarily possessing what each one of them thought, but could distill all of the reasons pro and con. The other men were Lawrence, Arthur Compton, and Fermi. This they did, and they arrived at the same conclusion as the interim committee, that they could see no other solution but to use the bomb without warning.
Even in the Manhattan Project laboratories, opinion was divided. 22 out of 150 consulted said they were in favor of any military use. However, when Leo Szilard went round the laboratories in July 1945, he got 70 signatures to a petition urging Truman not to weaken America's moral position by dropping the bomb. Oppenheimer could have known of this when Szilard went to Los Alamos, but did he?
My recollection of this is not completely sharp. I think it was after the war was over, though someone may have told me of it before. I didn't, I think, really find out about it until I came to Washington later.
But the Hungarian scientist Edward Teller was at Los Alamos and directly disputes this.
Szilard wrote me a letter and described the discussions he had with Professor Frank and with others. He asked me to join, and he asked that I should find others in Los Alamos to join. I went to the director and asked his advice, and he advised me in no uncertain terms that I should not participate and not ask anybody else. So I didn't.
The director was Oppenheimer, but other Los Alamos scientists share Oppenheimer's uncertainty and say the existence of the Szilard petition was not widely known. But anyway, it was too late now. By early July, Truman had received the unanimous recommendation from the interim committee on the use of the bomb, that it should be used against a genuine target in Japan and without prior warning. The Frank report had been discounted and its advice rejected. By July the 7th, Truman was out of reach, on board the Augusta, bound for the Potsdam Conference. The decision was his, and he'd taken it. The war with Germany was over before the Potsdam Conference, but the war with Japan was still a bloody and bitter fight. In military terms, Japan's position was hopeless. The Allies had unchallenged air supremacy, and her food and fuel supplies were dwindling critically under the blockade. Victory was not in doubt. But when, and after the loss of how many more lives? Some intelligence reports said the Japanese army was prepared to go on fighting until the last man was killed. The American war effort did not pause when Hitler was beaten. It was Japan, not Germany, who brought them into the war. Japan must be beaten. In the spreading, teeming laboratories of the Manhattan Project, the pace intensified. Groves had ordered that the first bomb must be ready for testing in mid-July and the second for dropping in August. The test was given the code name Trinity. The site chosen was the Alamogordo Desert, an Air Force bombing range in New Mexico. The date, July the 16th, 1945. Preparations had gone on for months. On May the 7th, 100 tons of high explosive had been detonated as a rehearsal. Since then, the desert had grown into a small town with stores, telephone cables, power lines, measuring equipment, cameras, spectrographs, and a mass of buildings and vehicles. The control and observation posts were heavily protected. There were 3 of them, all just under 6 miles from the firing point. The scientists inside would be the closest men to the explosion. They had to measure within the space of a few seconds details like blast, ground shock, time lag, delayed neutrons, and gamma rays from the world's first atomic explosion, or go back home after the most spectacular anticlimax in history. The strangest preparation of all was Jumbo. Jumbo was a 214-ton steel tank, 25 feet long, intended to preserve the plutonium for recovery if the bomb failed. It occurred to someone that if the bomb succeeded, half New Mexico would be littered with fragments of radioactive steel. Jumbo was abandoned before the test. The test was scheduled for the small hours of the morning. The scientists were brought from Los Alamos in coaches.
as I remember, 2 or 3 bus loads of us, and we set off at around about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, drove down. Well, the journey was an average chatty journey with physicists discussing this and that, and we got there about midnight, and there was a beautiful velvet desert night, and the thing was due to go off at something like before the dawn, and I was about, I think, 7 or 8 miles away with a group of people.
By all the scientists' calculations, the bomb was bound to explode, but none of them could say he knew it was going to. The point of detonation was a 100-foot steel-framed tower, but any man who looked at it at the moment of detonation would never see again. The weather was thundery. Because of the danger of lightning, it was only at the last moment that the bomb itself was carried to the tower. It wasn't much bigger than a car battery. Nearly all the scientists had made their own estimates of the size of the explosion it would cause, most of them, in fact, far below the actual result. They didn't know. Nobody knew. They had gone to the limit of calculation. Now they could only wait through the warm July night to see what happened when you released the greatest destructive force that man had ever dreamt of.
My own feeling, I can see now that it's rather a superficial feeling, was, what have we done?
And I remembered the line from the Bhagavad Gita, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I remembered that Sanskrit line.
The Alamogordo test took place one day before the start of the Potsdam Conference. Truman received the news in a cable from George Harrison of the Interim Committee. It said that the baby had been born, and added, the light in his eyes was discernible from here to Highhold, and I could have heard his screams from here to my farm. This must mean the flash was visible for 250 miles and the blast audible for 50. The question was, should Stalin be told? After agreeing it with Churchill, Truman mentioned it to Stalin casually as a devastating new explosive, but not saying that it was nuclear. Stalin showed little interest, perhaps because he didn't take it in, perhaps because he already knew a great deal through Klaus Fuchs, who was still at Los Alamos. The Potsdam Conference was interrupted by the general election in Britain, and Churchill, who'd been in touch with the Manhattan Project from the start, was defeated by Attlee. Attlee, like Truman, had known nothing of the project. So as the decisive moment approached, Britain and America were both led by newcomers to the idea of the atom bomb. Attlee still believed it was a more powerful kind of high explosive. Newsmen were now guessing the war would end in 1946. Air attacks with orthodox bombs grew heavier. In one raid on Tokyo, 80,000 people were killed and 1.5 million made homeless. Under the pressure, Japan made her first peace move. But she took soundings through Russia, and Britain and America thought it was just a move to keep Russia out of the war. By the end of Potsdam, it was agreed, without argument, that the bomb would be used. Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance. Politically, too, it saved the West from making unwelcome concessions to Russia in return for helping invade Japan. Now the Allies issued a surrender demand, threatening devastation, but not mentioning the atom bomb. Japan rejected it. The last chance had gone. To the American High Command, the dropping of the atom bomb was essential. Japan, a nation of fierce military pride, still had 5 million soldiers in the field, and the Allies would need as many to invade. and American lives were still being lost every day. The base chosen for the raid was the island of Tinian in the Marianas, 1,450 miles south of Hiroshima. The date, August the 6th, 1945. 2 B-29s were to fly the mission, one to drop the bomb, one to observe and record. The pilot of the bombing plane had named it Enola Gay after his mother, giving her an unexpected and perhaps unwelcome immortality. His name was Paul Tibbets. Everything, in fact, was ready by July the 31st. The bomb had been brought in 3 parts, each in a different plane, for safety. But the weather intervened, and it was another 6 days before the Enola Gay took off with the first ever atomic weapon on board. Close behind came the second plane with the observers and measuring instruments. On board the second plane were 3 scientists from Los Alamos. One of them carried a 16mm camera with which he made this record of the flight.
To get back to our instruments.
The bomb had been christened Little Boy. It had the equivalent destructive power of 20,000 tons of TNT. The Enola Gay released it and banked sharply. The first atom bomb in the world fell through the bright August morning towards the silent city of Hiroshima.
As soon as the bomb went off, the whole inside of the airplane just lit up as if someone had set off a flash bulb. And then we had to wait, and this was our big worry, is what would the blast do when the blast got to the airplane? And finally the blast did arrive. It was like being in an ash can and getting someone kicking. And then we crowded to the window and saw just the whole city completely covered in smoke with this very tall mushroom cloud rising from it, which now everyone associates with a nuclear weapon, but it was the first time we'd ever seen anything like that.
The seed planted during the beautiful years in Göttingen had borne its terrible fruit. The devastation, the 100,000 lives destroyed by a single bomb, are all part of history. But for Frisch and Fermi, Teller and Oppenheimer and all the other scientists who worked with the American government, a question still remains. Had they succeeded or had they failed?
People were crowding to the telephones to order tables in town to celebrate with a good dinner. And I remember I felt a little bit sick even at the time to think that people wanted to celebrate the fact that we had just killed 100,000 or so.
It was months, even years, before the full horror of Hiroshima became known even to those most closely involved in its destruction. At the time, it may have seemed they had solved a grandiose physics problem. Now the problem of physics has faded, but the problem of ethics remains. Looking back over 20 years, do they believe it was right or wrong to drop the atom bomb on Hiroshima?
I think it was wrong. And there are 2 reasons. First, it prostituted science. Until then, scientists were not considered very important, but they were kind of innocent. And the second reason, I think it was morally wrong.
I think it was right to drop the bombs because I believe that the dropping of these bombs brought the war to a close much quicker than would have been possible otherwise. I think if people here who now debate this question had seen the preparations which we were making for evacuating wounded, the hospital preparations and everything, anticipating an actual landing, that they would have realized that we actually saved lives, not only our own soldiers' lives, but the lives of the Japanese. Because had we been forced to actually attempt to occupy the islands, I think the death toll would have been tremendous.
In my view, it was wrong. If we had made a demonstration and that had failed, then I think dropping the bomb would have been justified in order to end the war. To drop it without warning was wrong. It was wrong on moral grounds. It killed many people. It was wrong, although I could not see that at that time, on practical grounds, because the dropping of the bomb has distorted our view, has changed our whole outlook. We are not looking on the accomplishment of atomic explosives as progress. We are not looking at it as progress, which can and should be used in the right way. We have started at that time to look at it as something horrible, something that should not be continued. This general trend took its very beginning, its very start, from the mistaken decision to drop the bomb.
There are passionate arguments. They do not persuade me one way or the other. At the time, the alternative, the campaign of invasion, was certainly much more terrible for everyone concerned. I think that Hiroshima was far more costly in life and suffering and inhumane than it needed to have been an effective argument for ending the war. This is easy to say after the fact.
I think I was shocked that this thing we'd done had killed a lot of people. But you must remember that I'd been involved with a lot of people being killed. After all, I'd come from Europe with Hitler's war in full progress. And it seemed possible to me that the overall effect might have been an economy of life. And these innocent people died, but perhaps the overall death roll was reduced.
We were all aware of the fact that in one way or another, we were intervening explicitly and heavy-handedly in the course of human history. That is not for a physicist a natural professional activity.